Maya Williams stood by the large window of their home, looking out at the slowly falling rain that covered the yard. Small drops trickled down the glass like tears, and the humid air saturated the atmosphere with a kind of vague longing. Tonight was an ordinary evening in their home, but every evening lately seemed like this for her, monotonous, heavy, like the slow rain outside the window. Her life seemed perfect at first glance. A beautiful home in Louisiana, a successful husband who seemed loving and caring, and everyday well-being. But Maya felt that something was wrong. Unspoken questions began to arise in her heart, growing louder with each passing day. Although the illusion of normalcy still existed on the outside, Carl Williams, her husband, was the type of person who always strived for success. He worked hard for his father's company, James Williams, and often came home late. Over the past few months, Maya had increasingly seen her husband only at breakfast. His attention was scattered among work tasks, discussing plans with James, and endless talk about expanding the business. At first, Maya tried to get used to this life. She understood that her husband was working hard for their future, but every day this loneliness grew. She began to notice how often she felt lost in her own home. The rooms seemed too big, and the silence too loud. Maya's gaze slid across the room, reflecting her alienation. The classically decorated living room, with its expensive furniture and paintings that Carl had chosen, did not seem cozy to her. The decor was part of the image of a successful married life. But inside this success, Maya began to lose herself. She walked over to the fireplace, her eyes resting on their wedding photos, where she and Carl stood smiling, young and happy. Everything seemed so simple and reassuring then. But now this photo only emphasized how far they were from that happy day. Carl came home at 8 in the evening, as usual, silently undressed, hung up his jacket, and went to his wife, quickly kissing her on the cheek. He didn't even notice how she sighed softly. Dinner was just as routine. A few formal phrases about his day at work, memories of meeting his father. No intimacy, no attention to what was going on in his wife's heart. "Dad says hi," Carl said, not looking at her as he picked up his pasta fork. He always spoke of James with admiration. James Williams was a figure everyone knew in the town. He was a wealthy entrepreneur who built his business on the oil industry back in the days of the crisis. Many considered him a role model, but Maya had mixed feelings about him. James was an impressive man, tall, always well-dressed, with a commanding voice that made everyone listen carefully. He had that magnetism that drew people to him. But behind the outward charisma, Maya saw something more, something she found hard to describe in words, a sense of power that was not just physical superiority. A few weeks ago, James came to their home with a gift for Maya. It was an expensive bracelet with gold inlays and diamonds. He said it was for their wedding anniversary, a gesture of generosity, as he called it. But the moment he put the jewelry on her wrist, Maya felt his hands a little longer than necessary. Their eyes crossed, and she saw something more than fatherly warmth in his eyes. It was a warning, a hint, a game. From then on, they began a strange and dangerous interaction. At first, it was just light phrases that could be taken as casual compliments. But each time, Maya felt that they were more than just words. She began to notice how James sought her eyes at family gatherings, how their conversations became more personal and intimate. Tonight, James came to their house again. He had a habit of showing up unexpectedly, as if he had deliberately chosen a moment when Carl was busy or away. When Maya answered the door, his smile was the same one she knew, but something else flashed in his eyes, delight. "Maya, I see you're alone tonight," he said in a low, measured voice, with a slight southern accent. "Carl's at work as usual," she answered, stepping back to let him in. James walked in, slowly looking around the living room as if to see if anything had changed since the last time he'd been there. He was always attentive to detail, his eyes never missing a thing. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, when he saw the photograph on the mantel. He took it in his hands, looked carefully at Carl and Maya's faces in the wedding picture, and then turned his gaze to her. "You looked very happy that day." "We were happy then," she replied, staring at him. There was a slight irony in her words that James did not miss. "But time changes everything, doesn't it?" He moved closer to her. lowering his voice to an almost intimate tone. "I notice the changes, Maya, and I like them." His words sent shivers down her spine. She knew that these changes were not just about her appearance. It was in her heart, in her thoughts, and she didn't know how far she was willing to go. "I don't think that's something we should talk about." Maya tried to change the subject, but her voice sounded weak, as if she doubted her own words. James smiled as if he understood better than she did. He stepped closer to her, and she could smell the light scent of his expensive perfume mingling with his own presence, powerful and dominant. "Sometimes it's better to tell the truth, even if it's not always easy." His voice was soft but firmly insistent. Maya looked at him, feeling her internal struggle become unbearable. She stood before him, not knowing whether she wanted to pull away or give in to what she was feeling. After all, he was the one who understood her, or at least she thought he did. Soon after, James left, leaving behind the tension that still vibrated in the air. Maya was left alone in the house, feeling him affecting her more and more with every step, every new look. And although she wanted to convince herself that this was nothing more than a casual flirtation, something inside her said that it was much more complicated. The next few weeks were a real test for Maya. Every day she felt more and more that her life, which had previously seemed predictable and stable, was now turning into a complex maze of contradictions. On the one hand, she was trying to maintain a normal relationship with Carl, her husband, who continued to be exemplary and caring, even despite his constant employment. On the other hand, she was drawn to James, who not only disturbed her peace, but also awakened feelings in her that she may never have known before. That evening, when James reappeared, they no longer hid the insidious game between them. At first it was hints his slow gaze that lingered on her a little longer than it should have, the light touches of his hands that seemed to meet by chance. But over time, these hints grew into something more, something much more dangerous. Maya remembered their first real conversation when the relationship began to go beyond mere flirting. It happened during another family evening when Carl stayed late at work, and James, as usual, did not miss the opportunity to be alone with her. They were sitting on the terrace when he said quietly, "You know, Maya, you don't look like the girl I first saw with Carl." Her eyes were fixed on the garden, where large magnolias grew. Their snow-white flowers reflected the light of the setting sun, giving the whole landscape a special, almost magical look. She tried not to react to James's words, but she knew it was useless. "What do you mean?" she asked, although she knew where the conversation was going. "You've changed. You have become a woman who is not afraid of her desires." His voice was as low as the rustling of the wind in the trees. Maya didn't say anything. She knew that something was wrong, but she couldn't help but feel her heart speed up at his words. She began to feel the unspoken desires he was talking about. She and Carl hadn't been close for a long time. Their relationship had become a routine with no room for real emotions. And although she realized that her father-in-law was playing with fire, she could not stop herself. "James, you shouldn't," she began, but her voice sounded weak, almost begging him to continue. He moved closer to her, their bodies almost touching. He smelled of expensive perfume and cigars, a scent that had long been familiar to her, even desirable. He whispered softly in her ear, "You and I are not like the others, and you know it. We both want more." That moment was the beginning of their secret game. She knew it was a mistake, but she couldn't stop. They started meeting more often. Carl was always busy at work, and Maya took every opportunity to see James. Their relationship went beyond words. It became more physical, intense, even dangerous. The first time they were alone in a hotel room just outside the city, Maya felt everything inside her burning with forbidden desire. She couldn't believe it was really happening. They entered the room, and James closed the door behind them. His hands gently touched her waist, and she felt herself trembling under his touch. "You want this as much as I do," he whispered in her ear. She nodded silently. Words were unnecessary. Everything had been decided long ago. Their meetings became more and more frequent, and each time the feeling of the forbidden made their relationship even more exciting. They met in secret places, a hotel in the countryside, his office late at night, even in a villa owned by James that he used for his business meetings. Their meetings became more and more passionate, but also more dangerous. Maya knew that her treacherous actions could be revealed at any moment. She felt that Carl suspected something, although he had not yet asked her directly. But every questioning look he gave her, every pause in the conversation made her nervous. One day, Carl came home late at night and was usually tired and focused on his work. This time, however, he seemed to be on guard. "Maya, we haven't talked in a while," he said as they sat at the table in the kitchen. His voice sounded a little unusual, not like his usual voice when he talked about work or their daily routine. Maya put down her fork and looked up at her husband. "Did you want to ask me something?" Carl paused for a moment. "You've been looking distant lately." "Distant?" she repeated, trying to keep her composure. "Yeah." His eyes were serious. "Did something happen?" Maya quickly thought about her answer. She knew she couldn't just tell him the truth, but she couldn't afford to sound too confident either. She decided to play the part of the concerned wife. "I'm just tired, Carl. All this time, your work. We don't spend much time together, and I feel a little lonely." Carl was silent for a moment, thinking about her words. "I'm sorry," he finally said, lowering his head. "I know I work too much. Maybe we should take a vacation." Maya breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that she had avoided a direct conflict, but she knew it was a temporary solution. Her relationship with Carl was slowly but inexorably headed for ruin, and the reason for this was not only his work. The reason was that Maya hadn't felt what a wife should feel for her husband for a long time. Her thoughts were always on James. Every meeting with him made her even more confused. She realized that their connection was abnormal, dangerous, but she couldn't give it up. He gave her something that Carl could not give her, a sense of liveliness, passion, and danger. At the same time, her guilt was growing. Maya began to wonder what would happen if their relationship was discovered. What would Carl say? What would society say? Her life, which she had built over the years, could be destroyed in an instant, and yet she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to James like a magnet. She felt that it was not just a physical attraction. James gave her a sense of power, of authority, that she had never had with Carl. He was an experienced man who knew how to control people, how to use their weaknesses to his advantage. Maya realized that she was one of those people, but she couldn't help herself. One day they met in his office late at night. James was sitting at his desk, looking through documents when Maya walked into the room. "I thought you weren't coming," he said, getting up from his seat. "I couldn't," she replied, coming closer. Carl was noticing more. "It was only a matter of time." He put his arm around her waist. Maya felt his touch reawaken the feelings she had been trying to suppress. "What if he finds out?" she asked, trying to look him in the eye. James shrugged his shoulders as if it didn't matter to him. "He won't find out if we're careful." Carl was always too busy doing his job to notice what was going on around him. His words were true, but they also made Maya feel even more guilty. She knew that she couldn't continue this relationship forever, but she didn't have the power to stop it. Their relationship became dangerous, not only for Maya. It began to affect her mental state. She felt more and more trapped and unable to find a way out. Her life became a game in which the stakes were too high. She started waking up at night feeling scared. What if it was discovered? What if Carl realized that his wife was cheating on him with her own father? Maya was beginning to lose control. Every day her connection with James became more and more dangerous, more and more real, as if she was standing on the edge of a cliff and couldn't stop herself. Her heart beat faster every time she was alone with her father-in-law, but each time this feeling brought not only desire, but also fear. Fear that sooner or later everything would be revealed. Her relationship with Carl was deteriorating. He became more wary, started asking her questions, and although Maya tried to answer calmly, her voice no longer had the confidence she had felt before. Something had changed. Carl noticed her alienation, and although he didn't say so directly, the tension between them grew every day. One evening, when Carl came home earlier than usual, he found Maya sitting on the couch, staring at the empty space in front of her. Her face reflected exhaustion and some deep inner struggle. "You're hiding something from me, Maya," he said suddenly. sitting down next to her. Maya quickly looked up, trying to remain calm, but she couldn't hide her excitement. Carl took her hand in his, but she felt a coldness in his touch that hadn't been there before. "You've been different lately. I don't know what's going on, but I can see that you're not with me. You seem to be here, but your mind and heart are far away. I don't know what it is, but please tell me the truth." He looked at her intently, as if trying to penetrate her soul. For a moment, Maya felt naked in front of him. Her secrets were too close to the surface. "You're imagining things, Carl," she tried to lie, but knew she didn't sound very convincing. "It's not imagination." His voice became more serious. "I can feel it, and I can't ignore it anymore." Maya felt her heart clench with panic. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't reveal that his own father had become her lover, that their relationship was beyond the pale, but now she didn't know how to stop this onslaught. Carl had already begun to suspect, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything would come out. "I'm just tired," she said, looking down, trying to come up with a convincing reason. "It's hard for me." Carl let go of her hand and looked away, but his face remained tense. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't insist anymore. His silence was heavier than any words, and it only increased her internal anxiety. The next morning, James showed up unannounced. He had a habit of showing up unexpectedly at their house, and this time was no exception. Maya opened the door, and her heart immediately began to beat faster. He was standing on the threshold with a slight smile on his face, as if nothing had happened. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping into the living room before she could answer. Maya closed the door and led him into the living room. She could see the same relaxed confidence in his eyes, but something about his manner was different. He looked a little worried, even if it was hidden under a mask of composure. "Carl is beginning to suspect." Maya couldn't keep it to herself any longer. Her voice sounded nervous, and she looked at James, waiting for his reaction. James sighed and put his hands in his pockets, as if he was about to give the answer he had been thinking about for a long time. It was only a matter of time. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Maya couldn't believe her ears. "Carl will find out. This could ruin everything. Our lives will never be the same again," he replied sharply. "Maya, you have to understand that this connection is what we both wanted, and now we have to think about how to keep it a secret." Maya was silent, not knowing what to say. She felt like she was getting more and more stuck in the web of this relationship, and there was no way out. The more she tried to find a solution, the deeper she sank into this chaos. "We have to be careful." James came closer and put his hand on her shoulder. "But don't be afraid. I will always protect you." Maya felt a chill run down her spine at his touch. Instead of comforting her, his words brought more confusion. The next few days were particularly tense. Carl became increasingly suspicious, although he did not express his suspicions directly. Maya couldn't stand the pressure. Her thoughts were chaotic, and she was constantly looking for ways to avoid the conflict, but nothing worked. One evening, Carl came home late, in a bad mood. He didn't say a word, just walked into the bedroom, threw his jacket on the chair, and fell silent. Maya felt that something had changed. Carl no longer tried to talk to her, but his silence was almost unbearable. Finally, when she was about to go to bed, he suddenly asked, "Did you see James today?" Maya froze. The question was direct and unexpected. She knew that Carl would never ask that question without a reason. "Yes, he came by," she answered, trying to remain calm. "He wanted to discuss some work matters." "Work matters?" His voice was dry, even hard. Maya was at a loss for words. It seemed to her that he already knew everything, that their lie was about to be revealed. "Is there something you're not telling me, Maya?" he asked, moving closer to her. His voice was tense, but there was a cold restraint in it that Maya didn't know how to interpret. She looked away, feeling her hands tremble. "No, Carl, it was just about work." But Carl wasn't listening to her anymore. He abruptly turned away and left the room, leaving Maya alone with her fear. The next day, things got even worse. Carl left for work early in the morning without saying goodbye to Maya, and she was left alone again in the big, empty house. She wandered around the rooms all day, trying to find something to do, but nothing could calm her nerves. Finally, late in the evening, James reappeared in their home. He came into the living room, his face tense. "We need to talk," he said, wasting no time on formalities. Maya looked at him with concern. She could feel something bad coming, and that fear clutched her chest. James sat down on the couch and looked at her, sighing. "Carl started investigating," he said finally. "He suspects something more than just aloofness. I found out that he was meeting with a private detective." These words came out of the blue. "A private detective?" she whispered. "He can't." "He's already started," James replied sharply. "And now we have to act." "Act? What do you mean?" James got up from the couch and walked over to the window. His face was stern, and there was a cold determination in his eyes. "We have to stop this before it's too late." "But how?" James didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark street, and then turned to her with cold certainty in his eyes. At this point, their relationship reached its most dangerous point. Maya realized that James no longer saw any other way out. He was ready to do anything to protect himself and prevent their relationship from being discovered. That same night, something happened in the Williams home that no one expected. Carl returned home late. After midnight, he entered the house, not realizing that at that moment, his fate had already been sealed. When he walked into the living room, he saw something that made his heart freeze. On the floor, surrounded by broken furniture, was the body of his father, James Williams. Blood stained the carpet, and a heavy metal object lay next to it, a watch James had given him a few years ago. Carl froze in his tracks, unable to believe his eyes. He ran to the body, trying to understand what had happened, but it was too late. The Williams house was surrounded by police cars, their lights glowing in the darkness, casting red and blue glare on the facade. The town that had always seemed peaceful woke up to the news of the death of James Williams, a powerful businessman who was not only a respected citizen, but also a man whose connections stretched far beyond the borders of this small town. Detective Emily Harrison stood at the front of the house, peering through the softly lit windows. Her face reflected the calm concentration that characterized her in these situations. Tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, she was always ready to go. Her reputation as an experienced detective with a quick mind and impeccable intuition had brought her here this morning. "What do we have?" she asked her partner, Detective Marcus Johnson, who stood next to her, a notepad in hand, taking quick notes. Marcus was much younger than her, energetic and always eager to get to work. His short haircut and athletic build betrayed a past in the military. He was a rookie compared to Emily, but his tenacity and sharp mind made him a valuable partner. "Looks like a simple murder. The body was found in the house on the living room floor. It seems the man was hit on the head with a heavy object. Nothing was stolen, the door was not broken. So far, everything points to a domestic case," Marcus said, flipping through his notes. Emily nodded, but her face remained unmoved. She'd seen scenes like this hundreds of times before, and she knew from experience that things were rarely as simple as they first appeared. "Who found the body?" "Carl Williams, the victim's son. He came home late at night to find his father dead. Carl looks shaken, but I didn't notice anything too suspicious. He was working late. He has an alibi." "And his wife?" Emily asked, not taking her eyes off the house. "She was home at the time of the murder, but she says she didn't hear anything. She says she went to bed early and only woke up when Carl raised the alarm." Marcus paused and added, "She seems very nervous." Interesting. Let's go talk to her first," Emily decided, and they both headed into the house. Maya was sitting on the couch in the living room where the murder had taken place a few hours earlier. Her hands were shaking, and her face was clearly panicked. She tried to remain calm, but the pressure of the events of the previous night was crushing her. James's body had already been removed, but the blood still stained the floor, and the sight made her heart clench in terror. "Miss Williams, I'm Detective Emily Harrison, and this is my partner, Detective Marcus Johnson," Emily said calmly, sitting down next to Maya. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." Maya nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "Please tell us what you remember from the evening. Where were you? What were you doing? Why was the victim in your house?" Emily kept her tone calm and professional, but her eyes were scrutinizing Maya's every move. I was at home," Maya began, her voice hoarse. "Carl was working late and I went to bed early. I don't know why he was at our place. I didn't hear anything until Carl came back and found my dad." "You're sure you didn't hear anything?" asked Marcus, looking over his notes. "No strange noises?" Maya shivered but shook her head. "No, I was sleeping. I was sleeping soundly." Her voice trembled. Emily looked down at her hands, which were nervously twisting the scarf. This behavior could have been a sign of shock, but there was something more in her eyes. "Do you see James often?" Emily suddenly asked. "Yes," she answered after a pause. "He used to come to visit us often. And how would you describe your relationship?" Emily looked at her carefully. "He was, well, my husband's father." Maya tried again to avoid the detective's direct gaze. Emily sensed that Maya was hiding something. Her behavior was too nervous even for someone who had experienced shock after the death of a loved one. Usually, people who find themselves in such situations either start crying immediately or fall into a stupor. But Maya looked as if she had been struggling with something for a long time, something internal. "Are you sure that's all? There were no conflicts between you?" Emily continued, trying to get Maya off balance. No, there were not." Maya wiped her tears. Emily was not convinced, but decided not to press further. "Thank you for your answer, Miss Williams. We'll talk to you again later." Emily stood up and signaled to Marcus that it was time to leave. As soon as they left the house, Marcus looked at Emily with a bit of surprise. "She's hiding something," Emily said quietly as she walked to the car. "You think she's involved?" Marcus asked. "I don't know if she's directly involved in the murder, but her behavior is definitely not consistent with the situation. She's too nervous and tries to appear calm. There's something about her story that doesn't add up." "What is it?" Emily stopped by the car, looking at the house thoughtfully. Her words sound too coherent for someone who has just lost a loved one, and that little thing about her avoiding direct contact all the time. Maybe it's just shock, but I'm not sure. Marcus nodded, writing down her remarks in his notebook. "What's next?" "Next, we'll talk to Carl and see if any new details come to light." Carl Williams was sitting in his office when the detectives approached him. His face was pale, but he held himself more confidently than Maya. The loss of his father had clearly taken its toll, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Mr. Williams, thank you for taking the time to see us," Emily began, sitting down across from him. "We understand this is a difficult time for you, but we need some answers to get to the bottom of this." Carl nodded, wiping his face with his hands. "I understand. You want to know what happened. I want to know too. Please tell us what you remember from last night." "Where were you? When did you get home?" Marcus asked. "I was working late. I was at a meeting with a client. I got home around midnight. As soon as I entered the house, I saw—" Carl stopped talking, unable to finish his sentence. He took a deep breath and continued. "I saw my father on the floor. Blood. All of it." Emily listened intently, noting every detail. "Did you notice anything suspicious when you entered the house? No strange noises, open doors, or windows?" "No. Everything looked normal. No break-ins. I thought it was just an accident, but then I realized it couldn't have been that simple." Emily exchanged glances with Marcus. "And your relationship with your father? How would you describe it?" Emily asked, watching Carl's reaction. Carl thought for a moment before answering. "Our relationship was complicated. My father was always a strong personality. He liked to control everything. Sometimes it was hard to bear, but we never really fought." "And with your wife? Did he get along well with Maya?" This question seemed to take Carl by surprise. He looked up at Emily, his face hardening. "Yes, they got along," he answered briefly. Emily could see him tense up at the mention of her father's relationship with his wife. It was an interesting reaction, and she decided to pursue it further. "Have you noticed anything unusual about their relationship lately?" Carl looked away, trying to find an answer. His hands trembled slightly as he answered, "I don't know. Maybe they were a little closer than usual, but I thought it was just parental concern. Nothing suspicious. Emily sensed that there was more to it than that. She knew there was more to James and Maya's relationship than just parental concern, but she didn't have any direct evidence yet. That's all for today, but we'll be in touch if you have any further questions. Carl nodded, remaining in his chair as the detectives left the room. As soon as they were outside, Marcus turned to Emily again. What do you think? I think there was something more between them. And I'm not talking about Carl and Maya. I'm talking about James and Maya, she replied. We need to find out what really happened between them. Detectives Emily Harrison and Marcus Johnson sat in a car in front of the Williams home, reviewing their notes. The investigation had begun to become more complicated, although at first it had seemed simple enough. They felt that something important was slipping through their fingers. There are a few inconsistencies that bother me, Emily said as she studied the notes from her conversation with Maya and Carl. Their testimonies don't add up. Carl seems pretty calm, even though he lost his father, and he didn't ask about the details of the investigation. That's strange. Yeah, and Maya is acting too nervous, Marcus added. I'm not saying that it definitely means she's guilty, but her fear seems excessive for a simple witness. I agree. And I think these two are hiding something. There was more between them than they're saying. The relationship between James and Maya couldn't have been just warm. Emily sighed and looked at the house. Time to get active. They decided to start by looking for evidence at the crime scene. Looking over the details from the scene again, Emily focused on what they still had to find. The blood at the crime scene indicated a strong blow, but it was not yet clear what exactly had been used. There are several heavy objects in the house that could have been used as a murder weapon, Emily noted. In particular, that antique clock that Carl mentioned in the conversation. Could it be the weapon? Asked Marcus when they returned to the house for a detailed examination. But let's take a closer look. They entered the house and began to look around. The living room looked the same as it had on the first day after the murder. The bloodstains on the carpet had already been recorded, but the detectives paid attention to every detail. The antique clock on the shelf by the fireplace looked completely undisturbed, as if it had not been moved for a long time. But it was one of the objects that could have been a weapon. Marcus picked up the watch and noticed that it was heavy, metallic, and had sharp edges. I think this is our piece, he said, carefully examining the watch. But how do we prove it's him? There should be blood on it or something else that would point to it as the murder weapon, Emily said, studying the object intently. The watch was immediately sent to the lab for analysis, while detectives continued to work on motivation and possible suspects. 2 days later, the results of the examination confirmed the worst guesses. There were traces of blood on the surface of the watch that matched James's blood type. There was a small compartment on the back of the watch. The experts carefully opened it, and there, wrapped in a thin cloth, was a bracelet. Why was the bracelet hidden in the watch? Asked Marcus. Emily thought about it as she looked at the jewelry. Her intuition told her that this bracelet played an important role in the whole story. Maya seems vulnerable, but I wouldn't rule out Carl, Marcus replied. His behavior is suspicious, even if he's trying to look calm. Yes, there's one more thing that worries me. Remember what Carl said about possible conflicts between his father and Maya? I think that relationship was a lot deeper and more problematic than they claim. We need to talk to both of them again. But this time we'll do it separately. Emily nodded in concentration. They decided to start with Maya. She looked even more agitated than before when she was invited to the police station for questioning. She was nervously moving her hands in her lap, and it was obvious that she was hiding something important. Maya, we found the murder weapon, Emily began, watching her reaction closely. A clock? She whispered, unable to hide her fear. Yes, and it has traces of James's blood on it, Emily continued. And we want to know what you can tell us about it. Maya was stunned. I didn't know. I didn't know it would go this far, she finally whispered. What would go this far? Emily asked insistently. James manipulated me. He controlled me, and I couldn't take it anymore. Maya could barely hold back her tears. Our relationship started out as something innocent, but then he started making me do things I didn't want to do. He took advantage of the fact that I was lonely. He was bossy. I tried to stop, but he wouldn't let me. Emily felt that this was exactly what she had been waiting for. The relationship between James and Maya was not just a casual affair. It was poisoned by manipulation and fear. You said you tried to stop. What happened the night of the murder? I didn't want to kill him, Maya whispered, clutching her hands. But he threatened me, said he would tell Carl. That bracelet became a symbol of our connection. He used it to control me. Every time I tried to escape from his grip, he reminded me of this gift and what it could do to my life. He said that if I dared to leave him, he would destroy my life. I was trapped. And what did you do? Maya was sobbing, her face contorted with grief and despair. We had a fight. I couldn't take it anymore. He came up to me, started screaming, and then I grabbed my watch and hit him. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a moment of panic. Emily sighed as she listened to her confession. This was not a planned murder. It was an act of desperation and panic, but it was still murder. You will realize that is no excuse, Emily said calmly. You should have asked for help sooner. Maybe we could have helped you. Maya was silent, wiping away her tears. Carl Williams was stunned to learn the truth. He could not believe that his wife was involved in his father's death. He did not know about their relationship, about how things had escalated between them. But now everything became clear. The verdict was inevitable. Maya was arrested for the murder of James Williams. She confessed to the crime, but her defense attorneys insisted that it was manslaughter in a state of passion. She was sentenced to prison in court. Although her motives were clear and the circumstances of the crime were not planned, the court could not let it go unpunished. Carl, who was left without a father and a wife, stood at the courtroom door, looking at the empty space in front of him. His life had collapsed in a single moment, and now he was left alone with his thoughts.